Once you've got a clear idea of the topic for a research case or the decision for a discussion case, it's time to actually start gathering data. And when you're dealing with organizations, you want to do this as efficiently as possible so that the organization does not lose interest over the course of case development. Normally, I begin the data gathering process with a second meeting, and in that second meeting, I try to clarify anything that was not established clearly in the first meeting. One thing that's very important to deal with is the notion of quotes. Because when you're quoting, you could be quoting the protagonist, you could be quoting people in the organization. And when it comes to quotes, there are some alternatives. You can record your interviews if you want to get precise quotes. I find that some people are a little uncomfortable when I have a recorder on, so that may or may not be to your preference. But if you're going to record, you should always ask before each interview if it's okay. Another thing you can do is paraphrase quotes, and I do this quite a bit. I will actually paraphrase a quote, and then I will go back to the individual and say, does this quote reflect what you said, or would you care to edit this quote so that it more clearly expresses what you said in your own words? Sometimes I will also contact an individual and ask for a quote on a particular topic. I say, you said something along these lines. Could you give me a paragraph or something that clearly states what you mean? You want to make sure that these ground rules are established so that there's no surprises and people going back to the protagonist and saying, hey, we didn't sign up for this. Another very important ground rule to set up is the circulation of rough drafts. Now, my preference is independent circulation, which is to say, if I've got a section that relates to a particular individual that I interviewed, that individual sees the section before anybody else does, and nobody else sees that section until the individual is comfortable with it. That way, I never accidentally hurt some individual's feelings by virtue of quoting them or describing them in ways that would make them uncomfortable. Because my job as a case writer is not to act as an efficiency expert or an auditor within a company. My job is to try to reflect what people are saying as clearly as possible, and I want to build a relationship with that organization. And if people are unhappy with my participation in the case writing process, then they will not want to interact with me at some point in the future. Now, another possibility is a coordinated circulation of rough draft where the contact point, usually the protagonist or the protagonist's secretary, is given all the drafts. They take a look at them and they decide who they need to be shared with. And this is sort of like the managed option as well. And the difference here is in the managed option, the protagonist will only show folks the case after he or she is happy with the draft, as opposed to doing it in a coordinated way where as the case develops, people see it. And then there's the broadcast way. If you're dealing with a group of individuals who are all peers and they all get along and it's a very informal situation, you can actually send out drafts to everybody at once and ask for comments. I would do this only if I was completely certain that there was nothing sensitive at all said in the case. And in some cases, that's probably an accurate reflection of what there is. Other ground rules that need to be set include getting permission for included materials. If you have a lot of material that is taken from the organization, not only are there intellectual property issues involved, but you have to be very sure that you don't put in things that, say, the marketing department was not want released. In some cases, the case writer will take responsibility for getting permissions. For example, if you use newspaper clippings, the organization may not want to take responsibility for getting the right to include them in the case, but clearly you need to include them in the case well, you need permission if you're going to include them in the case. Sometimes it's mixed, and this is usually what happens, where the member of the organization takes responsibility for getting permissions from the organization, and then the case writer gets permissions for everything else. I try to avoid third-party inclusions unless they already have some sort of Creative Commons or open source license that allows me to do it without permission, because that can really delay the release of a case. And then what do you do if they say no? A very important thing is the responsibility for setting up the interview schedules. And this is where I do see a lot of variation from organization to organization. In some organizations, the protagonist or my contact point actually takes responsibility for setting up interviews with me. That way, he or she has complete control over who I see and who I talk to. And for some organizations, that's exactly what they want. Sometimes there's a site administrator, such as the administrative assistant to the protagonist, who takes responsibility for setting that up. And then sometimes I'm just told to contact them. I'm given a company phone list or mailing list, and it's sort of my responsibility to set up a time that works for me and the individual I'm speaking to. None of these, I would say, are any better or worse than the others. They're just different, but you've got to make sure that they're set up as ground rules so you don't inadvertently offend the organization by going in and setting up interviews when the protagonist really thought he or she was going to be in control of that process. Once you've established all the ground rules, you can begin doing your in-depth interview of the contact, and then do all the remaining interviews. I usually recommend coming up with a checklist of who I need to talk to and that sort of thing. And this is the point where you're actually really gathering data. At some point in this process, as the case begins to form, if you're dealing with a discussion case, you probably want to revisit the release process. And there are really two ways a discussion case can be released. One, which is the most strict way, is prior to the first use. You don't even get to use the case once without a full release. Another is subsequent to the first use, where you get to use it in the classroom once, limit the distribution, and then there may be some subsequent changes based upon that use in the classroom that get made for the final release for publication. And I usually try to do the subsequent to first use. It makes the organization happier too if they can see a discussion before they actually do the final release. And it also almost always leads to a few changes in the case, because once I've got a case released, I don't really want to revisit that case with additional changes if I can avoid it, because there's always the possibility that they will say no.